Greetings, adventurer. You are most welcome here. I see my sword here has caught your eye. This is Vindaaris, forged by Darksword Armory. Since you have expressed interest in this sword, today we will be reviewing it, going over its individual component parts, discussing its handling characteristics, and finally analyzing some cutting tests to ascertain how this sword performs as a functional fantasy piece. We begin with a general introduction and overview to Vindaaris. And as you can see as I draw this sword from its scabbard, it is a big sword. This sword measures 49 inches in length from tip to pommel. The blade itself from tip to guard measures 36 inches in length. The handle from guard to pommel measures 10 inches in length, and the guard itself from quillion to quillion is 10 inches wide. The sword also weighs 4 pounds 12 ounces, so it is a bit on the heavier side of the sword spectrum. Now this sword also comes with its own unique scabbard. I'm going to set the sword down for a minute so we can take a look at the scabbard. The scabbard is a beautiful dark green. It is a wood core scabbard with leather wrap, similar to other Darksword Armory offerings, but that's where it starts to deviate. It has runes running down its length, and there are vine patterns framing those runes, reminiscent of elven designs. If you get the scabbard with the sword belt option, this sword also comes with a beautiful sword belt that is tooled with trees running along its length. It has metal embossings over the holes of the belt, and the buckle and the tongue of the sword belt also have vine designs. So it's a very pretty belt and scabbard structure, and is also very sturdy in its construction. And that plays all into the general theme of Vindaaris, and specifically the 3 fantasy themes that go into this sword. The first and most prominent of these are the runes running down the blade. This comes from Tolkien's works, inspired by Tolkien. The runes themselves are actually from Tolkien's Tengwar script, and they read, "Better to fight and fall than live without hope." They are set in the fuller of the blade, reminiscent of Anduril, Flame of the West. So it's very pretty, and it's very well done. Now, the name of the sword derives from Viking mythology, Norse mythology. Vindar pays tribute to the Norse god Vindar, who is more commonly known as Vidar. Vidar is the god of the primeval forest and of vengeance. He is a son of Odin, and more specifically the son of Odin, destined to avenge his father's death in Ragnarok by slaying Fenris the wolf. The third and final fantasy theme that this sword embodies is that from Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. Specifically, if you go to the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Holy Avenger longsword on page 175 has the same narrow ricasso and diamond flare on the blade as the Vindaaris does. So there's yet another inspirational source for the Vindaaris blade. Before we begin our discussion of the component parts of the Vindaaris, there are 2 swords I need to introduce because they are going to interject biases into how I perceive the Vindaaris sword. The first of these is relatively minor. This is a fencing épée. I train with this sword 2 to 3 times a week at a local fencing club, and I have trained in this particular style of swordsmanship for 3.5 going on 4 years now. The fencing épée is a one-handed sword and a thrusting sword, and it deals a lot in finesse. Now, because it exists in the sporting context and not in a martial arts type context, I'm not too worried about this sword interjecting much bias onto the Vindaaris, but nevertheless it is out there and it is a sword I am familiar with, so I just want you to be aware of it. The sword that will interject the most bias, however, is the black sword on the wall behind me. This is a windless battlecry Agincourt sword. I have had this sword for 1.5 years now, going on 2 years. I have trained with this sword in the Italian longsword style for the same amount of time. This is a sword I consider of ideal length and weight for me to use, and it handles like an extension of my arm. It feels, in other words, like it was a sword that was made for me. And that's going to interject huge amounts of bias into how I perceive the Vindaaris for one simple reason, and that being the Vindaaris has a longer handle and a longer blade than the Agincourt. Not to mention, it also weighs twice as much as the Agincourt sword. So I just want you to be aware of those biases because they will color how I perceive the Vindaaris, especially when we get to a discussion of how it handles. We are going to begin our discussion of the component parts of Vindaaris with the blade. Now, this blade is forged in 5160 high carbon steel that has been tempered. It is 36 inches in length from tip to guard. And you can see here, looking down the blade, it is relatively straight. Pretty good, nice and straight. The tip is also nice and straight. There's no warps or bends there. I will caveat that though, because the tip you are looking at is a repair job. When I first received this sword, the tip, if we use my hand as a guide, looked like this. It had a bend in it. And I don't know when that happened, but I contacted Darksword when I found out about it, and I asked them to repair it, and they agreed. And they did a really good job on the repair job. It's nice and straight, as you can see. They also made sure that they polished out any hammer marks that they might have had to make in straightening the tip out. So they made sure they cleaned up the finish on it very nice when they were done with it. That was a very good repair job. And that's a good segue into the rest of the fit and finish of the overall blade, because as you can see here, there it does have the fuller, very nice straight fuller, and that has been blended and polished to match the rest of the blade, which looks very nice. And the same go for the bevels, because I did opt to have this sword sharpened by Darksword, and the bevels are nicely polished into the sword as well. They're very discreet and they're difficult to see on camera. So overall, the fit and finish, they did a very nice job. And Darksword also did a very nice job on the runes too, I might add, because you can see when I hold them at a certain angle to a yellow light, and they also do this in red light, they appear to glow with their own inner fire. And it just creates a very cool visual effect. Very neat. Now, the most unique part of the blade and the entire sword is this ricasso here, the one that resembles a Holy Avenger sword from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. And this one is interesting because it was designed by an artist for a game without functionality in mind, but yet this particular type of feature is actually very functional, and specifically because it's not sharp throughout most of it. The sharpening starts right about here on the sword. So this is all blunt. That means that I can take hold of the sword on an overgrip like this, either for spear or to give myself some added length. And if I'm thrusting and I lose hold of my grip on my leading hand here, and it slides forward slightly on the blade, this diamond flare here stops my hand's forward momentum before it can slide onto the sharp part of the sword. Now that's kind of cool because it acts like a secondary guard. So it does actually have functional value aside from just being a very nice decorative piece. We are now transitioning our discussion from the blade of Vindaaris to the first of the hilt components, which is the guard. And you can see this guard is a graceful curved design. It has more Tolkien runes in the recessed part here. Those are also Tengwar. They're identical to those found on the blade, so they say the same thing. The curved design continues all the way out onto the quillings and terminates at the very tip of the quillings here in a very rounded tip. And those rounded tips, when pressed into the hand slightly, leave impressions in the skin, which means that if more force is applied with these quillings have the potential to deal a very, very nasty murder stroke to whatever their target is. So these quillings, in and of their own right, are very much a weapon on this sword. They aren't just a decorative feature. Now there is one decorative feature that bears special mention, and that's this centerpiece right here. And that's because you can see the metal lines here terminate in, they're not exactly sharp points, but they aren't smooth either. And so when the hand is resting up by them, against them, because this is where it's comfortable to hold the handle of the sword, those points dig into the skin to the point where they start to grate against bone. And that becomes extremely painful the longer this sword is held and handled, to the degree where I actually find my hand scooting down the handle into a less ideal position just to get away from those points because it hurts so much it becomes intolerable after a while. Now, You can use gloves to mitigate that effect, but it is a bit of a nuisance because the pressure doesn't fully go away. And that also precludes wrapping a finger around the guard like this to try to gain more control, point control, or edge control to guide the sword blade, because that just makes those points dig in even more than they do when the sword is just being held like this. So that is a major flaw in the guard design of the Vindaaris, but overall it's very pretty and there are some functional aspects to it. From the guard, we are now going to discuss the handle, sometimes called the grip. Now, the Vindaaris handle is wrapped in dark green leather that has a cord texture to it. As I've said before, it's 10 inches long, which is just long enough for me to fit 4 of my hands along its length. Now, the upper half of the handle here, close to the guard, is molded and tapered slightly, and it fits the dominant hand very comfortably and very securely. And when I say comfortable, I mean independently of the guard, because the guard is the source of the discomfort at this level. It's not the handle. If the guard did not dig into the handle would be both comfortable and secure as a grip for the dominant hand. Now the lower half here, closer to the pommel, is rounded instead of shaped and tapered like the upper section, but that still affords a very secure grip for the offhand. Additionally, you can see where the leather is wrapped here, it terminates in a seam. That seam is actually very discreet. It doesn't show any signs of wanting to lift up or any of that. So it's very well done there. It's very well secure. The only thing that really is bothersome on the handle itself is this decorative ring right here that bisects it. And it looks very pretty from a decorative standpoint, but if I do this, you can see it wiggles. And that becomes a bit of a nuisance when handling the sword, because when the offhand sneaks up to the ring, sometimes I will feel that move, and I will think, wait a minute, the handle's coming loose on the sword, which is not actually the case. The handle itself is secure to the tang, it's not going anywhere. It's the ring that I feel that's loose, so it always makes me do a bit of a double take, because I haven't yet been able to separate the ring being loose from the handle being loose. And that's something I'm learning to work around, but I do think that this could have been better contrived, at least better secured to the handle, because it just seems like a bit of a sloppy oversight on Darksword Armory's part, and it has the potential to look very good. It looks very nice, it just gets in the way sometimes when handling this sword. The final component part of the sword we are going to discuss is this pommel here. And this is a very nice pommel from an aesthetic point of view, as you can see, but it also has a lot of functional value that it derives directly from its design. And the principal functional value in the pommel are these inward curving recesses here, the ones that give the pommel kind of a staff-like appearance. And these come into play when I'm holding the sword and I want to slide my offhand down against the pommel. And those curves fit very nicely into this section of my hand here at the base of my pinky. So when I rest my hand against the sword's pommel, it settles very comfortably into that recess and allows the folds of my hand, when I clench my fist where it folds, to actually fold around the ridges here. So when I swing the sword and have to exert some pressure with my offhand against the pommel to stop the sword, all of that fits very comfortably into my hand. There's no sharp points, there's no uncomfortable points. It fits my hand like it's a complement of my hand. It was made for my hand. And that's just very nice from a handling standpoint. So the pommel is really well done, both from an aesthetic point of view and from a functional point of view. And one last little piece we'll just touch on here. You can see the peen in the pommel right here. It's very smooth. When I run my fingers over it, there's no sharp points. It's a very well done peen. It's very solid in its construction. Overall, Darksword did a really good job on this pommel. We are now going to discuss the handling characteristics of the Vindaaris sword. And the biggest observation I can give about its handling characteristics is this sword is difficult to control without an investment of time in learning how it wants to move. Between its weight and its just sheer size, this sword has a tendency, when you actually make a cut, to pick up momentum when you get to about this point. So if you watch, swing down, it picks up momentum past that center point, and and it's really, really hard to stop on the dime. It actually doesn't stop on a dime at all, so I amend my statement there. Now, the pommel helps a lot on these downward cuts because it fits into my hand really well. So I can leverage this hand against the pommel and counteract some of that momentum coming through the blade to try to get a little bit more control over the sword. But at the same time, this is still very much a sword that you have to feel it and not try to command it. You have to feel where it wants to go and adjust accordingly, use its momentum against it like I'm doing here to direct it where I want it to go. Now, that is difficult from the perspective of anyone who wants to do just casual backyard cutting. Maybe you want to train with it, maybe you just want to take it out and swing it around. It's not something that you can just take off the wall anytime you want and go play with it. You actually have to train a bit with it and learn it. As the same applies here on this cut, I can do it now after extensive training, but it puts a lot of strain in this arm, both directions. And it doesn't feel very good after a little while of doing that. It also puts a lot of strain on the wrist, elbow, biceps, shoulders. I get sore after using this sword. Now, on an upward cut, I have gravity on my side, so I have a little bit more control, but it'll still pick up momentum, and it still has a mind of its own. It goes where it wants, and the best I can hope to do is guide the edge to where I would like it to be. Now, on the thrust, you have a little bit more control, but again, extensive training is required. The first time I tried to thrust with this sword, it took me clean across the room. I probably ended up stumbling 5, 6, maybe even 7 feet. I didn't exactly keep track, and I was extremely off balance. So from a safety standpoint, that was not very good. But now, after training, I have better control over it. Again, the pommel's helping me a lot, but I do have to take a step to deal with the sword's momentum and to try to rein it in. Now, stepping away from that aspect of the handling, I'd like to talk just a little bit about the ricasso and how that factors into this. So, as I've said before, the ricasso's not sharp. The diamond flare keeps my hand from running up onto the sharp part of the blade, so when I half sword it like this, I can thrust okay, and I won't ever run a risk of my hand running past the diamond point onto the sharp part of the blade, which, given how heavy this sword is and how unwieldy it can get if you try to stop it and actually control it, that's a good thing. So I won't have to risk cutting my hand open like this. I don't even think I'd be comfortable doing true half swording like this, because I just can't control that blade's momentum enough to feel safe doing this. I might accidentally cut myself. That's why I'm wearing the glove. So that's all I really have to say about the handling. And aside from that, if you want a sword like this, or this particular model, I would recommend to be prepared to train with it, really. This is not just a sword you can take off the wall and go out and have fun with. You do have to practice with it. Welcome back. Now that we've had a chance to watch the cutting footage, I would like to take this opportunity to discuss the results. Now, when I cut the paper with the Vindaaris sword, you can see that the blade sheared more than actually cut the paper. And one side is notably messier than the other. And that can be accounted for by the fact that when I cut on the right-hand side of the paper in the image that's on this video, I was using the factory sharpened edge that Darksword Armory provided. The left side I did after I stropped one edge of the blade just to see if that would improve the cutting performance at all. And it did to some degree for the paper, but it's still a shear rather than a cut. Aside from that, though, the stropping really didn't do anything for the melon or the water bottle tests. Now, when I cut the melon with Vindaaris, that was a very satisfying result because the blade went clean through the melon. I didn't feel any resistance on the blade at all, which was great. The only indication I had that I actually hit the melon was that it fell over in two pieces on the floor. So it does really well cutting fruit. Water bottles, however, are more of a mixed result. You can see some of those I'm actually getting a cut on. Some of those it's more of a bludgeon, or in some cases it's just a plain old home run like I hit it with a baseball bat. In large part, that's on me and my form not being the best with this sword. As I've commented before, it's heavier than what I'm accustomed to, so that was throwing off my edge alignment. Now, that's also why I took the sword to my friend Mitch, who also trains with swords and is good at cutting, and just asked him to do a test cut on the water bottle just to see, is this my form or is this a sharpening problem? And he was able to ascertain that this really is more of a sharpening problem than actual user performance, although in my case, both of those together account for poor performance. So shout out to Mitch. Thank you once again for helping me test a sword sharpness through the cutting tests. I really appreciate your input and your insight. At this stage, we have gone over the component parts of this sword, discussed its handling characteristics, and reviewed its cutting performance. Now it's time to bring all that together for a final conclusion on this sword. And the framing question I pose to you, adventurer, is this sword suitable for the use you would intend to put it towards? That's important because this is not an inexpensive sword. It costs between $715 and $840 US, depending on sharpening and scabbard options. And that's not an insignificant amount of money. So the value that you find in this sword is going to largely depend on how you intend to use it. I'm going to cover 3 common uses sword enthusiasts put their swords towards, and the first of these is aesthetics. Now, if you want a sword just to hang on the wall, you want it because it looks cool, or you want to wear it with a costume like I am here, this sword is probably of good value to you. It does have some minor cosmetic flaws, some fit and finish problems, such as the ring here on the handle. It doesn't necessarily look the cleanest where it sits on the leather. The connection here between the handle and the pommel looks a tad sloppy. If those don't bother you, and they don't bother me, but some people I know are a lot more sensitive to that sort of thing than I am, especially on a sword of this price point, then this sword might be a good sword for you from that aspect. Most sword enthusiasts are not just content with a pretty wall hanger sword, and that leads us to the second most common use that a functional sword gets put to by its master, and that is the casual backyard cutting. Now, this sword can cut. I will preface it, it can cut. Mine doesn't cut particularly well right now, but I can put a better edge on it at a later date. That's all besides the point. We're not talking about whether or not it's just a good cutter at all. It's whether it's a good casual recreational cutter. And to that, I would say this is not the best sword for that, because it does actually require a bit of investment of time in training, learning how to use it properly, learning the quirks of it, how to deal with its tendency to just take off once you apply a little bit of momentum to it, stuff like that. So this is not a sword that you can just grab off the wall or wherever you have it displayed or stored and run out into your backyard to do some cutting. You actually have to invest time and training into this sword. Even my friend Mitch, who is a trained swordsman, before I handed this off to him to do the test cutting on the bottle, he even swung this around for 5, 10, maybe even 15 minutes to get a feel for the sword before he actually ever made a cut with it. So if that's something that you can't afford to do or are not interested in doing, then this sword might not be the best for you and your style. That segues in neatly to the third use sword enthusiasts commonly put their swords towards: training. Now, this sword is an excellent training sword for a certain class of swordsmen, but is a terrible choice of training sword for another class of swordsmen. And that lies principally in this sword being terrible for learning new technique, but excellent for refining existing technique. So this is not a sword for a beginning swordsman who wants a cool looking sword that they can learn technique and train with, because this sword's weight and unwieldiness will make it difficult to control, and consequently there's a high risk of learning technique wrong. But if you're an intermediate or advanced swordsman, this is a good sword for refining your existing technique, because you already know the moves, you know how to control the sword, and this sword's unwieldiness can help increase strength of blows, it can help with endurance training, but it also helps tighten up form, because the sheer amount of control needed to keep this sword in line and under control helps tighten form up very well when it translates to a much lighter and easier sword, such as the Windless Battlecry behind me. So I never personally myself learn new technique on the Vindaaris. It all goes through the Windless Battlecry first. Then I take that technique once I have it down and refine it on the Vindaaris. So in that capacity, the Vindaaris is a very excellent sword, just not for beginners. Overall though, this is a very, very nice sword. It is both a beautiful and a functional fantasy sword with fantasy designs that fit well in most fantasy settings. Some of the fantasy designs, even, contribute to unique functional features of the sword, such as the narrow ricasso neck and diamond flare on the blade, and the quillions of the guard. Now, the sword does have shortcomings that affect the three primary uses a sword enthusiast will put their sword towards, but the severity of these shortcomings depends in large part on owner or would-be owner preferences and tolerances for flaws in their swords. What I have tried to do here is provide you with as much information as possible on the Vindaaris sword so you can take that knowledge, go forth and do with it what you will. Farewell, adventurer. May your sword stay sharp and your wits sharper.